Recall knowledge can be a useful action for allowing characters to find effective tactics in Pathfinder's 2nd edition encounters. However, it can be subject to a fair bit of GM interpretation. While I think the game is most enjoyable if the GM is on the generous side, that is always a matter of table preference. However, I will discuss my preferred ways to run recall knowledge, including some bits for helping with dubious knowledge and other related incorrect information. Recall knowledge is a one action ability, almost equally used in combat and out. Let's review the traits on it before we go too far, since it's a good habit to always review the traits on abilities. In this case, it has the concentrate and secret. Concentrate will seldom matter outside of things like disruptive stance or other reactions that trigger on concentrate activities. Secret is already subject to table preference, and we won't open that can of worms here. Personally, I love Foundry's blind GM role when online, but often prefer non-secret player roles in person. The DC is set by the GM, but 9 times out of 10, they'll be using the level appropriate DC for a creature or hazard in combat, possibly with the rarity adjustment. We'll go over a few nuances of the rarity adjustments later. But you can also keep in mind the non-rarity portion of the DC adjustment table for when you think some knowledge is widespread. For instance, knowledge such as dragons having a breath weapon. This could have the incredibly easy adjustment in most settings. But you might still need the normal difficulty roll to know what type, what energy the breath weapon is, its range, any particular riders. Things of that nature would still require the more esoteric or the more involved knowledge of a level appropriate check. Now, the Raw does say that typically the first recall knowledge is to answer, "What is this?" with a critical success or follow up recall knowledge needed for more information. I personally consider this a bit too restrictive and find that it discourages people from trying to use recall knowledge. If you only get actionable information on a crit or on a second attempt, but the second attempt is often at a higher DC, it trains people not to try. So if you want to teach your players to use recall knowledge, I've typically found that the first successful check should give the identity, some flavor, plus one question of the player's choice. That's enough of an introduction. Let's look at an illustrative example. Let's say the party stumbles upon a horrible amalgamation of bones, bat wings, and a skeletal scorpion's tail. The party has fought skeletal creatures before and suspects this is some skeletal variant, but still wants to know more. So on a player's turn, they try to recall knowledge and ask if they can roll religion to identify it. Now, this is a place where their initial hypothesis is wrong. This is not undead, it's a devil. But it's still the correct skill. Religion works for undead and fiends, so I'd allow the roll. If they had asked to use undead lore or skeletal undead lore, depending on my degree of trust with the player, I might allow that, but it would limit the information they can get. The DC in this case for religion is 26, which is the level 9 DC by level, without any modifier. It would be DC 24 for an appropriate lore, but again, that's not what's being tried in this particular example. So let's say they roll a success. I would tell them it's an oceloth, also known as a bone devil. They are devils charged with seeking out heresies among mortals and devils alike. What about them are you trying to recall in particular? Most of my players ask for weaknesses as their first question. So in this case, I would answer, like most devils, they have a weakness to holy. I personally dislike giving non-actionable information, so if the party didn't have a source of holy damage, I would probably also give the resistances. They resist non-silver, physical damage, and poison. Sometimes my parties will ask for special abilities instead. In this case, I'd probably give the Sadistic Strike ability. They can do bonus damage to enfeebled, frightened, or prone creatures. As this feels like it is likely to shape the player's strategy, the Stygian Inquisitor could also be a good ability to give, especially if it already had the Zone of Truth up at the time the recall knowledge happened. Players will assume the tail is poisoned, so unless they ask about the poison specifically, I think it would feel like it's not giving them anything particularly valuable. Now, let's say they roll a critical failure. I'd ad lib something. It's a skeletal chimera that's formed when disparate creatures' remains are left jumbled in a desecrated location. They inherit abilities from each of its constituent parts. If the party asked about its weaknesses, like most skeletons, they have no weaknesses, and the standard skeletal resistances of cold, electricity, fire, piercing, and slashing. If they asked about special abilities, I might say none, or maybe mention a reach reactive strike with the tail, as I think that looks believable. When giving false information, I try to ensure it's easily disproven with an action or two. If they try a bludgeoning strike, as would be expected for a high level party against a skeletal opponent, and see it still has resistances contrary to their recall knowledge, that's properly disproven in one successful strike. Though, if they just try to brute force through the slashing and piercing, it might take more time to discover the error. And for the example of a wrong skill, such as wanting to roll Undead Lore on the Oceloth, or crafting if they thought it was some form of animated construct, for a lot of groups that I'm more familiar with, I would allow it. But probably not with a new group or a PFS group. There I would still go through the full collaboration on deciding a skill in advance. In the cases where I allow it, though, on success, they typically get something like, "It's not undead." You remember hearing about devils that are often confused for undead constructs of this nature. And you know devils are usually less resilient to silver. My goal is to give them enough of a lead to pick the right skill, and one of the most general traits of that family of creatures. I typically don't let them ask a targeted question in this case. And of course, if they get a critical failure, I can just say it's what they thought it was. It makes it very easy to come up with false information. I can pull up that creature's stat block that they were kind of hypothesizing it to be ahead of time. And when it comes to giving false information, here's some other tips for some of the easiest things I found to come up with quickly on the fly when needed. First, if they're asking about weaknesses or resistances, take the existing ones, flip them. Not invert, because invert wouldn't make sense. But if it says it resists cold, say it's weak to fire. This type of flip feels believable most of the time for creatures. For special abilities, adding or removing a reaction is often very easy. Reactive strike, things like stand still, counterspell, these can cover a variety of fighter or caster presenting types. I don't like something such as nimble dodge, as it's not particularly actionable for how people play their tactics. But saying it does or doesn't have a sneak attack or all around vision to make it hard to flank, that can influence the way the party engages with the creature and is at least interesting. Less common for my current groups, but many groups will ask for the weakest save, especially if they are a very caster heavy group. And in that case, I'd like to give the middle save as the wrong answer. The best save is often just too unbelievable given the creature's build and appearance. But the middle save feels about right. It's wrong, it's often between the two, so that tends to work out pretty well. Now, the one final bit we wanted to cover is talking about the role rarity adjustments have in setting the recall knowledge DC. And in this case, I feel there's two branches to consider. One, are all members of this creature's type the same, less than common rarity? Let's say a Bodak, for example. Here, the uncommon +2 adjustment makes sense. It's a more esoteric creature that's not always uncovered. It wouldn't be covered in all the textbooks or things people have read, so it's a little harder to read about or to remember. However, the place where this can cause problems, and it's very common in adventure paths, is a named unique opponent. Let's say Sarah the Succubus. And let's say Sarah here has one or two unique abilities and a customized spell list. Now, knowing those details would require the +10 unique adjustment. But knowing the general succubus information would just take the usual +2, as it is a uncommon demon. I'd personally prefer to clarify with the player before they roll which of these DCs are they aiming for. Knowledge about this particular special named creature, or knowledge about their ancestry, their species in general. Since I personally don't like to compare a single check against two different DCs, though I know that is a common practice for some GMs who would just roll once, compare it to both the unique and the uncommon, and synthesize an answer out of that. I'd prefer to have the players decide which of those they're going for. I hope this has been useful as a primer and things to think about when running recall knowledge. If you want to discuss more details of this, if you want to ask for advice on other parts of PF2, please let me know in the comments. And thank you all.